Here's something Abraham does exactly once in his entire life, never again, not even for God's own prophets. He bows to a stranger, hands over a tenth of everything he owns, and never asks the man's name, because apparently he already knows it. That stranger appears for exactly 3 verses in the book of Genesis. No birth, no death, no father listed, no mother listed, no tribe, no genealogy, in a book that spends entire chapters tracking who begat whom. He blesses Abraham, takes the tithe, and walks out of the story completely. Then, 1,000 years later, a king writing a psalm addresses this same unexplained man directly, as if everyone should already know exactly who he is. And 1,500 years after that, an entire chapter of the New Testament argues that this 3-verse stranger outranks every priest Israel ever had. His name was Melchizedek, and the Bible never tells you where he came from. Sit with how strange that actually is, because in the world this text was written in, it's not a small omission. Genealogy wasn't decoration in the ancient Near East, it was identity itself. Genesis spends 9 chapters early on doing almost nothing but genealogy: who fathered whom, how long they lived, who their sons were. Later, when Israel organizes itself as a nation, your entire legal standing, your land, your right to serve as a priest, your place in the community, depends on being able to prove your line. Centuries later, when Israelites returned from exile in Babylon and some priests couldn't produce their genealogical records, they were removed from the priesthood on the spot. No exceptions. That's how seriously this culture treated the question, who is your father? Melchizedek shows up with none of it. No father named, no mother named, no record of his birth, no record of his death, no tribe, no lineage connecting him to anyone else in the text. In a book obsessed with exactly this information, one man gets a complete blackout, and the writer of Genesis doesn't explain the gap, apologize for it, or even seem to notice it. He just moves on to the next verse. Compare that to literally everyone else Abraham meets. When Abraham's servant goes looking for a wife for Isaac, the first thing anyone asks the woman at the well is whose daughter she is. Her family line is treated as essential information before the story can even continue. When Abraham buys a burial cave, the text names the field, the exact number of shekels, the witnesses, the transaction details, all preserved as if they mattered for the historical record. This is a culture and a book that documents genealogy and provenance obsessively for people and even for real estate. And then a king walks into the narrative, blesses the most important man in the book, receives a tenth of everything he owns, and the text records absolutely nothing about where he came from, not his father's name, not his people, not even how he came to worship the God Abraham worships in the first place. Every other gap in Genesis eventually gets filled in somewhere. This one never does. Not in Genesis, not anywhere else in the Torah. That silence sits untouched for 1,000 years. Then it gets picked back up on purpose by 2 different writers who clearly think it matters enormously. Here's what's actually sitting inside that silence, concretely. 2 words the text itself translates for you, and a deliberate rhetorical move built entirely out of what Genesis doesn't say. The first word is his name. The second is the name of his city. Put together, they form a 2-part message the text hands you directly, not one we're reading into it. And the missing genealogy isn't a hole later writers awkwardly work around. It's the exact detail one of them builds an entire argument on top of. If a 3-verse character casually outranking Israel's entire priesthood 1,000 years later is new to you, that's the exact kind of thing this channel exists to dig up. A like helps more people find it. Now, to see how the key actually works, we need the scene this all comes from.
Genesis 14 opens with a war. 4 regional kings invade the area around Sodom and Gomorrah, defeat 5 local kings, and haul off plunder, including Abraham's nephew Lot, who's been living in Sodom. Abraham hears about it, arms 318 men born in his own household, chases the invading coalition north, and in a night raid, routs them and brings back Lot, the other captives, and all the recovered goods. On his way home, 2 kings come out to meet him. The first is the king of Sodom, whose own people and property Abraham just rescued. The second is a man the text hasn't mentioned before this moment. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. He blesses Abraham directly. "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand." And Abraham responds by giving him 1/10 of everything he recovered. Now watch what happens 2 verses later, because the contrast is the whole point, and it's easy to read past. The king of Sodom offers Abraham a deal. "Keep the goods, just give me back the people." Abraham refuses, not politely, but with an oath. "I have lift up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine. Lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich." He won't take so much as a shoelace from the king who owes him everything. And yet 2 verses earlier, he hands over 10% of everything he owns to a man he's never met, without being asked, without an oath, without a word of negotiation.
Abraham, the man later called the father of faith, the man who negotiates with God himself over the fate of Sodom, who never once in the entire book of Genesis kneels to a human king, treats this particular stranger differently than anyone else he ever encounters. The text doesn't explain why, it just shows you the behavior and moves on, the same way it moved on from his missing genealogy 2 verses earlier. Worth noticing, too, this is the first time the phrase "priest of the Most High God" appears anywhere in the Bible. Before the Levites exist, before the law is given at Sinai, before Israel exists as a nation at all. There is no ordination scene, no ritual establishing Melchizedek in that role, the way there will be in exhaustive detail for Aaron and his sons centuries later in Exodus and Leviticus. He is simply already a priest, already recognized as legitimate by Abraham himself, functioning in a role the rest of the Torah will spend entire books formally instituting.
So here's the 2-part key the text actually hands you, not a guess, a direct translation built into the New Testament's own reading of the name. His name, Melchizedek, in Hebrew, Malki-Tzedek, breaks into 2 parts, Melech, king, and Tzedek, righteousness. King of righteousness. That's not commentary added later, it's the literal meaning of the word, and Hebrews 7:2 states it outright. First being by interpretation, king of righteousness. The second part of the key sits in the name of his city. He's called King of Salem, and Salem, Shalem in Hebrew, is built from the same root as shalom, peace. Hebrews draws that out too in the very next phrase, and after that also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. King of righteousness, King of peace. And notice the order, it's not accidental. Righteousness first, and peace only after, as a result of it, not the other way around. Not a fragile peace bought by ignoring what's wrong underneath it. A king who claimed only righteousness, without peace, would just be another judge handing down verdicts. Melchizedek's 2 titles, sitting on top of each other in a single man's name and city, describe something rarer, an actual right relationship that produces real peace as its fruit, not its substitute.
That's the name. The blank genealogy is a different kind of key entirely, and it's the one the writer of Hebrews reaches for next, on purpose, as an argument rather than an accident.
The silence around Melchizedek doesn't stay quiet forever. About 1,000 years after Genesis 14, King David writes a psalm, a coronation psalm addressed to a coming king, and inside it sits this line, spoken as if the reference needs no explanation at all. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. David reaches back a millennium to a man who appears in exactly 3 verses and uses him as the standard against which an eternal priesthood gets measured. That's Psalm 110:4, and centuries later it becomes one of the most quoted Old Testament verses in the entire New Testament, applied directly to Jesus.
The writer of Hebrews picks that thread up and pulls hard on it. His argument across chapter 7 runs like this. Every priest in Israel had to prove descent from the tribe of Levi. That was the entire basis of their authority. But Abraham, the ancestor of Levi himself, paid tithes to Melchizedek and received a blessing from him. And, without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better.
In the writer's logic, Levi, in a sense, paid tithes to Melchizedek too, because Levi was still in the loins of his father when Abraham met that stranger on the road. A priesthood that existed before Levi and that Levi's own ancestor bowed to is a priesthood the Levitical system itself can't outrank. The writer pushes further still. If the Levitical priesthood had actually been capable of making anything perfect, why would the psalmist bother predicting a completely different kind of priest, one after the order of Melchizedek, not after the order of Aaron? The very fact that Psalm 110 reaches past the entire existing priesthood to name a different pattern is treated as proof that the existing pattern was never going to be enough on its own. And unlike Aaron's descendants, who held office only until they died and had to be replaced generation after generation, this priest holds his office, in the writer's words, not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life.
Then comes the phrase that gives the whole passage its edge: without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Read carefully, this is not a claim that Melchizedek was literally eternal, angelic, or divine. It's an argument built out of absence. Genesis records no birth for him and no death, which, for every other figure in the book, would be unthinkable. And the writer of Hebrews treats that documented silence as a deliberate shape, a priesthood the text never closes, standing in contrast to a Levitical priesthood that the text tracks generation by generation, death by death, replacement by replacement. Silence used as an argument. That phrase, made like unto the Son of God, has fueled a genuine debate for centuries over who Melchizedek actually was. One reading, held by a number of early church writers and still argued today, is that this was a Christophany, Christ himself appearing before his incarnation, wearing the role of priest-king. But the Greek word behind made like, aphomoiomenos, means made similar to or resembling, grammar that describes someone patterned after the Son of God, not the Son of God himself. If Hebrews meant to identify the two directly, this is an odd way to say it. A second reading, the more common scholarly position, takes him as exactly what Genesis presents, a real historical Canaanite king-priest of Salem, whose only significance is that his priesthood existed entirely outside and before the system built on Abraham's own descendants. A third, older Jewish tradition identifies him with Shem, Noah's son. By the genealogical math in Genesis, Shem would still have been alive in Abraham's lifetime, and later rabbinic sources make that identification directly. All three readings take the text seriously. They simply resolve its silence differently.
The silence didn't stay empty in the intervening centuries either. A scroll recovered from Cave 11 at Qumran, dated to the last 2 centuries before Christ, shows that by the late Second Temple period, some Jewish readers had already expanded Melchizedek into a heavenly, almost angelic figure, a coming judge who executes God's justice at the end of days. Whatever else that tells us, it confirms this wasn't a minor character nobody thought about between Genesis and Hebrews. Something about those 3 unexplained verses kept demanding a bigger answer than the text on its surface provided. Here's what's worth sitting with. Every priest in Israel needed the right ancestry to serve. Every Israelite standing in the community traced back to proving the right family line. And the priesthood the New Testament holds up as superior to all of it belongs to a man with no family line at all, whose entire credibility rests on nothing he inherited and nothing he could produce documentation for.
If you've ever felt like belonging to God required the right resume, the right upbringing, the right history, a family that modeled it for you, years of proof before anyone would take your faith seriously, this is worth noticing. The priesthood the text calls greater isn't the one with the longer paper trail. He chose, out of everything available to him, to explain why Jesus, who wasn't from the priestly tribe, who had no Levitical credentials whatsoever, could still legitimately hold the office of high priest. The precedent had to exist somewhere in the text for that argument to work at all. It existed in 3 verses in Genesis, in a man whose entire qualification was that nothing about his origin was ever recorded.
Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A king appears for 3 verses with bread and wine, blesses a man who bows to no one else, and receives what Abraham refuses to give even a rescued king. His name means King of Righteousness. His city's name means King of Peace. Righteousness first, peace because of it, not instead of it. 1,000 years of silence, then a psalm that reaches back to name him as the standard for an eternal priesthood. And a New Testament writer who takes the very absence of his ending, no death recorded, no successor named, and turns it into the shape of a priesthood that never has to be replaced. Trace the whole line again, start to finish. A 3-verse king in Genesis with no family and no ending recorded. A single line in a psalm 1,000 years later naming him as the pattern for something greater still to come. An entire chapter in Hebrews built on the fact that Abraham, ancestor of every priest Israel would ever have, bowed to him first. And a debate still unresolved after 2,000 years over whether he was simply a man the text chose not to explain or something more. Every piece of it traces back to the same 3 verses, and every piece of it depends on the same deliberate silence. Bread and wine, offered by a man with no beginning the text ever records and no ending it ever closes. That's the image worth keeping. Not a mystery left unsolved, but a silence used on purpose, pointing at a priesthood too complete to need a family tree. If you've spent years assuming you needed the right spiritual pedigree, the right church background, the right years logged, the right family who got there before you, before your faith could really count, stick with Melchizedek a little longer. Genesis never tells you where he came from. It doesn't need to. What made him significant was never his family line. And if that's true for the priesthood the whole New Testament says is greater than every other one Israel ever had, it's worth asking what it means for you. Next time this book asks you to trace where someone came from, remember the one time it deliberately didn't, and let that be the answer instead. If this is the first time anyone's connected Genesis 14 to Hebrews 7 for you, tell us in the comments which part surprised you more, the tithe or the silence. Subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of verse, the one sitting quietly a few chapters over from the one everybody already knows.